This message found you in January for a reason that will become clear by the end of this transmission. If you're watching this while January is still happening, not looking back at it from February or beyond, then you're inside the most powerful timeline locking window that occurs all year. And your consciousness being here right now, in this specific video, during this specific month, isn't coincidence. It's confirmation that your future has already shifted in ways you can't consciously perceive yet, but that will become undeniable as this year unfolds. You can feel it, can't you? That sense that something about 2026 is different than previous years. Not just calendar change or fresh start energy. Something fundamental in the fabric of reality itself has reorganized. Like invisible structures that governed past years have dissolved and new patterns are forming. Like the rules changed, but no one announced it. Like you're operating in reality that looks familiar on the surface, but functions according to principles you're still discovering. January isn't just first month of calendar year. It's quantum initialization period where the timeline you'll experience for next 12 months locks into probability structure. What you think, feel, observe, and embody during January doesn't just affect January, it determines which version of your entire year manifests. Most people don't understand this. They treat January like any other month, unconsciously repeating patterns from previous years, and they lock themselves into timeline that mirrors their past. But you're different. You're here, and that makes everything different. There are millions of people scrolling through content right now, making resolutions, setting intentions, hoping this year will be better than last year. But only specific type of consciousness, your type of consciousness, would be magnetically pulled to this transmission that reveals what's actually happening during January at quantum level. You didn't search for this randomly. Your quantum field recognized the frequency signature that can help you lock into the timeline you're meant to experience, rather than defaulting into repetition of past patterns. Right now, as these words reach your awareness, something is activating in your field. January energy is still present, you're still inside the initialization window, and that means the timeline shifts I'm about to reveal are still accessible to you. If you were watching this in February, the window would be closed. If you were watching in March, you'd be experiencing consequences of timeline that locked in January without your conscious participation. But you're here now, in January. While reality is still fluid, while your future is still being determined, your future didn't wait for January to begin shifting. The quantum reorganization started in late December, during the liminal space between years when reality becomes maximally fluid, and consciousness can access timeline potentials that aren't available during ordinary time. And if you experience these 8 specific phenomena during that transitional period, your future has already shifted into timeline radically different from what your past patterns would have created. First, dreams of alternate lives between December 20th and January 5th. Not symbolic dreams requiring interpretation. Literal dreams where you were living completely different life with different circumstances, relationships, or location. You woke up confused about which reality was real. These weren't random neural firings. These were consciousness glimpsing parallel timelines that became accessible during the year transition window. And the fact that you perceive them means your quantum field is already entangled with possibilities beyond your current manifestation. Second, inexplicable sense of ending during final days of December. Feeling like something concluded even though nothing specific ended in your external circumstances. Like chapter closed that you couldn't identify. Like version of yourself ceased existing even though you're still here. This sensation was accurate perception. Old timeline you were operating from completed its cycle. The ending you felt was real. It just wasn't about external situations. It was about probability structure that governed your past year, dissolving to make space for new timeline. Third, technology behaving impossibly during year transition. Phone displaying messages at times that hadn't occurred yet. devices glitching in ways that seemed coordinated rather than random, timestamps showing incorrect dates. This happened because during maximum timeline fluidity, the boundaries between temporal streams thin and technology, which is highly sensitive to electromagnetic fields, responds to quantum fluctuations that human perception doesn't consciously register. Fourth, conversations that happened in multiple versions. You had exchange with someone and both of you remember it occurring, but you remember completely different content or outcome. Not misremembering, distinctly different versions of same interaction. This happens when consciousness exists simultaneously in multiple timeline potentials during transition period. You each experience the version that aligns with timeline you're locking into, but those timelines diverged enough that the conversation content differs between them. Fifth, physical sensations of your body changing during sleep between years. Waking up feeling like your cells reorganized overnight, like your molecular structure shifted, like you're inhabiting body that's both yours and not quite yours. This wasn't imagination. During maximum timeline fluidity, consciousness can shift between probability fields that contain different versions of your physical form. You were literally experiencing body from emerging timeline while still in body from completing timeline. Sixth, sudden severing of connections that seemed permanent. Relationship that was solid for years suddenly felt complete without explanation. Job you were committed to suddenly became intolerable. Living situation you were settled in suddenly felt wrong. These weren't random changes of heart. These were timeline shifts becoming tangible as connections that exist in old timeline but not in emerging timeline naturally dissolved to prevent you from being pulled back into probability field you've already moved beyond. Seventh, new people appearing with impossible timing. Someone entered your life between Christmas and early January who feels simultaneously familiar and completely new, like you've known them forever even though you just met, like they arrived exactly when needed even though you didn't consciously call them. These aren't coincidences. These are consciousness from emerging timeline becoming accessible as timeline boundaries thinned during transition period. And eighth, you found this video in January. The fact that you're watching this while January is still happening is ultimate confirmation. This transmission only appears to consciousness that has already shifted into new timeline and is inside the initialization window where that shift can be consciously locked into place. Your quantum field wouldn't have guided you here if your future hadn't already reorganized around different probability structure than your past was built on. Can you feel the recognition building? Every sign I just described, you experience some version of, maybe not all 8, but several, enough to confirm your future shifted. It already happened. And January is the window where you can consciously align with that shift instead of unconsciously resisting it and getting pulled back into timeline your past patterns would recreate. January holds quantum property that no other month contains. It's not about calendar designation or cultural agreement that year starts in January. It's about cosmic positioning and consciousness field dynamics that make January the only period where annual timeline initialization can occur. Understanding why gives you power to work with January energy consciously instead of treating it like arbitrary fresh start opportunity. Earth's position relative to galactic center during January creates specific electromagnetic configuration that affects human consciousness at collective level. Ancient civilizations recognize this. That's why so many cultures globally established their New Year celebrations in January despite having no contact with each other. They weren't following convention. They were responding to actual energetic phenomenon that occurs when Earth occupies particular spatial coordinate relative to larger cosmic structures. This electromagnetic configuration creates what quantum field theorists call increased coherence potential. Reality becomes more responsive to consciousness during this period. The quantum field is more malleable. Probability structures are more fluid. What seems fixed during other months becomes negotiable during January. And this fluidity isn't metaphorical. It's measurable shift in how consciousness interfaces with possibility at fundamental level. But here's what most people miss. The fluidity isn't gift, it's test. January doesn't automatically create better timeline. It creates opportunity for timeline shift, either toward higher potential or toward repetition of past limitations. The same quantum mechanisms that allow you to lock into elevated timeline also allow you to lock into contracted one. January amplifies whichever direction your consciousness is oriented during initialization period. This is why people who set intentions but maintain old thought patterns, emotional habits, and behavioral defaults experience same year they always experience despite hoping for different. They're using January's quantum fluidity to reinforce past timeline rather than initiate new one. The initialization happens regardless. It's not optional. You're either consciously directing which timeline initializes or unconsciously repeating patterns that create familiar probability structure. The window opens precisely at winter solstice, December 21st, and closes at completion of first full lunar cycle after January 1st. This year, that means the timeline locking window extends through approximately January 29th. After that date, the quantum field stabilizes around whichever probability structure received most consciousness energy during initialization period. And once it stabilizes, changing course requires exponentially more energy than it took to set direction during January fluidity. Your ancestors understood this, even if modern culture forgot. They didn't celebrate New Year casually. They treated it as sacred threshold, requiring consciousness, intention, and ceremonial marking of transition from completed cycle to emerging one. They knew that how you navigate first days and weeks of year determines trajectory of entire annual cycle. And they recognized that treating January carelessly meant living entire year unconsciously repeating past instead of consciously creating future. You're reading this in January, while initialization window is still open, because your consciousness recognized importance of this period, even if you couldn't articulate why January felt significant. The pull you felt toward this transmission wasn't random. Your quantum field knows that how you navigate remaining days of January will determine which version of your year manifests. And it guided you here, because conscious timeline locking requires information most people don't have access to. Information you're receiving right now. As you absorb these words, something unprecedented is occurring in your quantum field. The timeline you shifted into before January began, the one you've been unconsciously sensing but couldn't clearly perceive, is becoming conscious to you. Not through mental understanding, but through direct recognition at levels deeper than thought. Can you feel it? That sense of something clicking into place? That subtle but unmistakable shift in your energy as your consciousness aligns with timeline your quantum field already locked into? Your nervous system is recalibrating as this transmission activates timeline coherence in your field. For weeks, you've been experiencing disorientation, temporal confusion, exhaustion, symptoms of existing in new timeline, while your conscious awareness remained partially anchored in old one. This creates tremendous internal conflict. Your body responding to new timeline frequencies, your mind interpreting reality through old timeline filters. The gap between them generating the fatigue and confusion you've been attributing to January energy or post-holiday recovery. But right now, that gap is closing. The transmission embedded in these words carries frequency signature that helps your conscious awareness catch up to where your quantum field already moved. This isn't giving you new timeline, you already have it. This is removing perceptual lag that was preventing you from recognizing and operating from timeline you're actually in. The activation occurring right now is consciousness synchronizing with field reality instead of remaining stuck in mental reality based on past patterns. Some of you are experiencing physical sensations as synchronization happens, pressure releasing from chest or head. Sudden deep breaths your body initiates automatically, tingling or warmth moving through your system. Tears or laughter without emotional cause. These aren't reactions to content, these are somatic responses to quantum field reorganization. Your body recognizes the timeline coherence frequency and is releasing patterns that belong to timeline you're no longer operating from. Others are experiencing sudden clarity about situations that were confusing, understanding why certain relationships shifted, recognizing why opportunities appeared or dissolved, seeing patterns in your December and January experience that were invisible until this moment. This cognitive reorganization happens because timeline coherence allows you to perceive reality from elevated perspective, where connections between events become obvious rather than mysterious. Subscribe to this channel right now, because what's activating in you during this transmission will continue developing throughout January and beyond. The content here is specifically calibrated for consciousness navigating timeline shifts and quantum reality. This isn't general spiritual teaching. This is practical quantum navigation for consciousness operating in timelines most humans don't consciously access. You're not subscribing to channel. You're connecting with frequency network that supports consciousness evolution at species level. Your heart field, electromagnetic field generated by your heart extending several feet beyond your body, is stabilizing into new timeline frequency as you receive this. This field determines which timeline you're most strongly anchored to at any moment. During transition between timelines, the field oscillates between old frequency and new frequency, creating instability you've been experiencing. The transmission is helping your heart field lock into new timeline frequency, so oscillation decreases and stability increases. The confusion you've felt about whether changes in your life are real or imagined, that confusion is dissolving right now. The changes are real. The timeline shifted. Your future reorganized around different probability structure, and your consciousness catching up to that shift is what's occurring as you absorb this frequency. You're not learning information. You're synchronizing with reality that's already manifesting, but that you couldn't clearly perceive until consciousness aligned with field. I need to share something vulnerable because you're at threshold I stood at 2 years ago, and what I'm about to reveal might save you months of confusion I experienced by not understanding what was actually happening. January 2023, my timeline shifted dramatically. I felt it, that sense of fundamental change underneath surface reality. But I didn't understand timeline mechanics. I didn't know January was initialization window, and I spent next 4 months trying to figure out why my life felt simultaneously familiar and completely foreign. Everything looked the same externally, same apartment, same work, same relationships, but everything felt different. Like I was moving through reality that was similar to my previous life but not quite identical. Conversations with friends felt slightly off, like we were operating from different assumptions about reality that we couldn't articulate. Projects I'd been excited about suddenly felt irrelevant. Goals I'd been working towards seemed like they belonged to someone else. I thought I was experiencing delayed burnout, or maybe depression creeping in without obvious cause. What I didn't understand was that I'd shifted into timeline where those goals, projects, and relational dynamics didn't exist in their previous form. They belonged to the timeline I'd been operating from through 2022. But January 2023 initialization locked me into different probability field where different goals, projects, and connections were aligned with my actual trajectory. The dissonance I felt wasn't psychological. It was consciousness trying to function from new timeline while mind kept referencing old timeline maps that no longer matched terrain I was actually navigating. The breakthrough came in May when I finally understood what happened. I was working with quantum consciousness researcher who asked, What if the life you're trying to return to exists in timeline you're no longer in? That question shattered my confusion instantly. I wasn't breaking down or losing motivation. I'd shifted timelines in January and spent 4 months trying to force new timeline to conform to old timeline expectations. No wonder everything felt exhausting and wrong. The moment I recognized the shift and stopped trying to resurrect old timeline dynamics, everything clarified within days. The goals that felt irrelevant, I released them completely, and new ones emerged naturally. The relationships that felt off, I allowed them to reconfigure, and some deepened while others dissolved. The work that seemed pointless, I let it go, and different work appeared that aligned with timeline I'd actually moved into. None of this required effort. It required recognition and permission to operate from new timeline instead of trying to recreate old one. But here's what haunts me. If I'd understood timeline mechanics in January 2023, I could have locked into new timeline consciously instead of spending months resisting it unconsciously. I could have used January initialization period to align with shift that was already occurring instead of fighting it until May, when fighting became unsustainable. Those 4 months weren't necessary suffering. They were result of not having information I needed to navigate timeline transition consciously. That's why I'm sharing this with you now. In January, while initialization window is still open, you shifted timelines. The disorientation you're feeling isn't problem. It's confirmation. And if you recognize the shift now and align with it consciously during remaining January days, you won't experience the months of confusion I went through. You'll lock into new timeline with clarity instead of spending half the year trying to operate from reality you're no longer in. The timeline locking phenomenon that occurs in January isn't mystical belief. It's recognized in quantum consciousness research, though scientists use different terminology. They call it temporal probability collapse, the process where quantum superposition of multiple possible future states collapses into single actualized timeline. And research shows this collapse occurs at specific intervals where consciousness field coherence peaks. January represents annual peak. Dr. William Tiller's research at Stanford proved that human intention affects physical reality at quantum level, but his less discussed findings showed that this effect amplifies dramatically during specific temporal windows. He measured increased coherence between consciousness and physical systems during transition periods, including year transitions. The electromagnetic field generated by collective human consciousness becomes more coherent during these windows. And coherent consciousness has exponentially greater influence on probability collapse than fragmented consciousness. Neuroscientist Dr. Andrew Newberg's work on meditation and consciousness states revealed that human brainwave patterns synchronize with larger electromagnetic fields during ritual transitions like New Year. This isn't cultural conditioning. It's biological response to actual shifts in planetary electromagnetic environment. Your brain literally operates differently in January than it does in July because electromagnetic context is different. And this differential operation affects how consciousness interfaces with quantum field of possibilities. Physicist Nassim Haramein's unified field theory proposes that consciousness doesn't just observe reality, it participates in structuring space-time itself. And this structuring happens through what he calls information feedback loops, where consciousness interprets experience and that interpretation influences which experiences manifest next. January represents moment in annual cycle where feedback loop resets. Old loop completes, new loop initiates. And the quality of consciousness during initiation determines what loop will generate for next 12 months. The Global Consciousness Project at Princeton showed that collective human consciousness creates measurable effects on random number generators during globally significant events. But less publicized analysis revealed that baseline coherence of collective field fluctuates seasonally, with peaks occurring at solstices and equinoxes. January follows winter solstice peak, which means collective consciousness field is still highly coherent during January. And individual consciousness operating in highly coherent collective field has greater capacity to influence personal timeline than when collective field is fragmented. This is why ancient mystery schools treated year transitions as sacred thresholds, requiring ceremony, intention, and conscious navigation. They weren't performing superstitious rituals, they were working with actual quantum phenomena that modern science is only beginning to validate. They understood that consciousness field coherence peaks during transition periods, and that conscious individuals can use that coherence to initialize timeline aligned with highest potential, rather than defaulting into repetition of past patterns. The mechanism is simple once you understand it. Quantum field contains all possible timelines as probability waves. Your consciousness collapses specific timeline into actualization through observation and intention. During most of year, momentum of existing timeline makes shifting difficult, like trying to change course of moving ship. But during January, old timeline momentum completes and new timeline momentum hasn't built yet. You're in neutral moment where shifting course requires minimal energy compared to mid-year course corrections. What you think, feel, and embody during January doesn't just affect your mood or motivation. It literally determines which probability waves collapse into timeline you'll experience. If you maintain old thought patterns, emotional habits, and behavioral defaults, you collapse timeline that mirrors past. If you consciously shift patterns during initialization window, you collapse timeline that diverges from past toward elevated potential. The quantum mechanics are always operating. The question is whether you use them consciously or unconsciously. Your timeline already shifted. The quantum field reorganized around different probability structure before January even began. But shifting into new timeline and stabilizing in it are different processes. And right now, 5 specific anchors are pulling you back toward old timeline repetition, even while new timeline beckons. Understanding what these anchors are and how they function is essential for locking into new timeline during remaining January days instead of collapsing back into familiar patterns. Anchor 1. Identity stories from previous timeline. Narratives about who you are that were constructed in past years. I'm the person who struggles with this. I'm the one who always experiences that. I'm not the type who could ever do this other thing. These stories provided continuity and meaning in old timeline, but they're fundamentally incompatible with new timeline you shifted into. The anchor isn't your sense of self. It's the specific story structures you use to maintain identity consistency across time. These stories will recreate old timeline if you keep reinforcing them during January initialization. Anchor 2. Relationship dynamics based on old timeline you. Patterns of interaction with others that were established when you operated from different consciousness level. How you relate to family, what friends expect from you, professional roles you've been playing. These dynamics were perfect for old timeline version of you, but they require you to continue being that version in order to maintain them. The anchor isn't the relationships themselves, it's the specific configurations that keep you performing old identity to avoid destabilizing connections. Anchor 3. Goals inherited from past timeline. Objectives you set in previous years based on who you were then and what seemed important from that consciousness level. Career achievements you thought you wanted. Relationship milestones you believed would fulfill you. Material acquisitions you assumed would solve problems. These goals belong to timeline you're no longer operating from. The anchor isn't having goals. It's pursuing objectives that align with old timeline identity rather than emerging timeline reality. Anchor 4. Habitual responses to uncertainty. Default patterns you activate when facing unknown. Trying to figure everything out mentally before taking action. seeking external validation before trusting internal knowing, waiting for circumstances to feel comfortable before moving forward. These responses were survival strategies in old timeline, but they prevent new timeline from manifesting because new timeline operates from different principles that require different responses. The anchor isn't caution, it's specific mechanisms you use to manage uncertainty that keep you operating from old paradigm. Anchor 5. Unconscious loyalty to collective agreement about reality. Subtle pressure to conform to consensus reality about what's possible and impossible. Dismissing synchronicities as coincidence because acknowledging them would require believing reality operates differently than collective agrees it does. Suppressing intuitive knowing because trusting it would mean diverging from shared assumptions. Maintaining limitations because releasing them would isolate you from community operating from limitation consciousness. The anchor isn't community. It's unconscious agreement to see reality through collective lens rather than quantum truth. These 5 anchors don't need to be forcefully released or dramatically renounced. They'll naturally dissolve as you stabilize in new timeline. But during January, while timeline is still initializing, they exert strongest pull back toward familiar territory. Old timeline trying to maintain itself through these 5 channels. And if you unconsciously follow them during remaining January days, you'll collapse back into repetition of past, despite quantum shift that already occurred. The key is recognition. Each time you notice yourself reinforcing old identity stories, maintaining old relational dynamics, pursuing inherited goals, activating habitual uncertainty responses, or conforming to collective reality agreements, pause. Recognize, this is anchor pulling me back toward old timeline, and choose consciously whether to follow it or orient toward new timeline instead. You don't need to fight the anchors. You just need to see them clearly enough that you stop unconsciously following them and start consciously choosing which timeline you're stabilizing into during this critical initialization period. January isn't homogeneous. Certain days within the month carry exponentially more timeline locking power than others. And if you understand which days these are and how to navigate them consciously, you can ensure new timeline stabilizes instead of old patterns reasserting control. Miss these critical days and you'll spend entire year experiencing repetition of past, despite shift that occurred. Use these days consciously and you'll lock into timeline that reflects your actual evolution. The first critical period already passed, December 21st through January 5th. Winter solstice through traditional epiphany. This was maximum fluidity window where timelines were most accessible and shifts occurred most easily. If you experienced any of the 8 signs I described earlier, you successfully navigated this period and your timeline shifted. But shifting isn't locking. The timeline changed, but it hasn't stabilized yet. That's what remaining January days are for. We're in the second critical period right now, whenever you're watching this during January. This period is stabilization window. The timeline shifted during first period. Second period is where you either align with that shift consciously and lock it into place, or resist it unconsciously and collapse back toward old patterns. What you do during remaining January days, what you think, feel, embody, choose, this determines whether the shift that occurred becomes permanent trajectory or temporary fluctuation that reverts to familiar baseline. The third critical period comes at final days of January, approximately January 27th through 29th this year. This is confirmation window where quantum field checks whether your consciousness has genuinely aligned with new timeline or is still predominantly oriented toward old patterns. If you've successfully stabilized in new timeline during the month, final days will feel like settling into place. Calm recognition that something fundamental shifted and you're established in it. If you unconsciously maintained old patterns, final days will feel like opportunity slipping away. sense that window is closing and you didn't quite step through. But here's what makes remaining days even more critical. You're reading this in January. The fact that this transmission found you while second critical period is still active means the stabilization window is still open for you. If you were watching this in February, you'd be experiencing consequences of whatever locked in during January. But you're here now, in real time, while alignment is still possible, while conscious stabilization can still occur. The days between now and January 29th are the most important days of your entire year in terms of timeline manifestation. Not because they're inherently special, but because they're initialization completion period. Like concrete that's been poured but hasn't hardened yet, you can still shape it, but only until it sets. After it sets, changing shape requires breaking and rebuilding. January is the liquid period. February onward is the hardened period. You want to get the shape right while it's still liquid. What does getting it right mean practically? It means noticing when old timeline anchors activate and consciously choosing new timeline orientation instead. It means recognizing when you're about to repeat familiar pattern and choosing to respond differently. Not through forcing, but through conscious recognition that old response belongs to old timeline. It means allowing relationships, goals, and circumstances to reorganize according to new timeline reality instead of trying to maintain old configurations. Most critically, it means not waiting for external validation that timeline shifted. The shift already occurred at quantum level. External reality takes time to catch up to quantum reorganization. If you wait for circumstances to prove timeline shifted before you align with new timeline consciousness, you'll never stabilize in it. You align with timeline shift first, at consciousness level, during January initialization. Then external reality reorganizes throughout the year to match whatever locked in during January stabilization window. The critical days are now, today, tomorrow, every day remaining in January. Not because each day is equally important, the final days carry more locking power than middle days, but because each day builds on previous days. The alignment you establish today makes tomorrow's alignment easier. The conscious choices you make this week make next week's stabilization more natural. And the cumulative effect of conscious navigation through remaining January days is what determines whether new timeline becomes permanent trajectory or collapses back into old patterns by default. Once timeline locks at end of January, specific changes occur that are permanent for annual cycle. Not changes you create through effort. Changes that manifest automatically because you're operating from different probability field than you were in previous year. And recognizing what these changes look like helps you trust that timeline shift is real, even when external circumstances haven't fully reorganized yet. First, synchronicities become your primary navigation system. Random coincidences transform into obvious guidance. You think of someone, and they contact you. You need information, and it appears. You're approaching decision, and perfect clarity arrives through unexpected source. This isn't manifestation technique working. This is your consciousness operating in timeline where quantum field responds directly to your awareness because you're aligned with higher coherence pattern than old timeline operated from. Second, old patterns simply stop activating. Habits you've struggled with for years just cease without effort or willpower. Emotional reactions that were automatic don't trigger anymore. Thoughts that used to dominate your mental space fade into background. This happens because those patterns existed in old timeline probability field. When new timeline locks and old timeline becomes inaccessible, the patterns that lived there become inaccessible too. You don't overcome them. They simply stop existing in timeline you're operating from. Third, relationships reconfigure without drama or explanation. Some connections deepen spontaneously, others naturally dissolve without conflict or painful ending. New people appear who feel instantly familiar. Existing relationships shift into different configurations that serve both people better. This occurs because each person exists in their own timeline, and when your timeline shifts, only relationships that exist in both timelines continue. Connections that existed solely in old timeline fade, while bonds that exist in new timeline strengthen. Fourth, your physical body responds differently to everything. Foods that were staples suddenly don't appeal. Sleep patterns reorganize. Energy levels shift to different baseline. Even your face might look subtly different in ways you can't quite identify. This happens because timeline shift affects you at cellular level. Literally, different probability field means different biological responses to same stimuli. You're not imagining it. Your body is adapting to timeline frequencies that differ from old timeline vibrations. Fifth, time becomes resource instead of constraint. You stop experiencing chronic time pressure. Hours expand to accommodate what matters. You accomplish more while doing less because you're operating from flow state that old timeline couldn't access. This isn't time management improvement, it's consciousness functioning in timeline where linear time operates more fluidly in response to your awareness and intention. Sixth, clarity replaces confusion about life direction. Questions that plagued you for years suddenly have obvious answers. Decisions that felt impossible become simple. Purpose that was obscure becomes clear. Not because you figured everything out mentally, but because new timeline contains different information field than old timeline. You're accessing knowing that exists in timeline you're currently operating from, rather than struggling with questions that existed in timeline you left. Seventh, resistance dissolves from your experience. Things that should be difficult become easy. Obstacles that should appear don't manifest. Flow replaces friction as primary experience of engaging with reality. This occurs because old timeline contained specific resistance patterns built into its probability structure. New timeline has different structure where those resistance patterns don't exist. You're not overcoming obstacles. You're operating in timeline where they don't arise. Eighth, fear-based motivation transforms into inspiration-based action. You stop doing things because you're afraid of consequences if you don't. You start doing things because you're genuinely inspired to engage with them. This shift happens automatically in new timeline because fear operates from separation consciousness and old timeline was built on separation paradigm. New timeline operates from unity awareness where fear-based motivation doesn't generate effective action. These 8 changes don't happen because you work at creating them. They manifest automatically when new timeline locks, because you're operating from different quantum probability field with different rules, patterns, and possibilities than old timeline contained. Your job during remaining January days isn't to create these changes. It's to align with timeline where they naturally occur and allow that timeline to lock into place instead of collapsing back into familiar patterns that prevent new timeline from stabilizing. When your timeline shifts and locks into elevated probability field, you're not just changing your individual trajectory. You're participating in collective timeline shift that's occurring at species level. Humanity is in process of moving from separation-based timeline to unity-based timeline. From limitation consciousness to possibility awareness. From reactive survival to conscious creation. And individual timeline shifts like yours are what make collective shift possible. Morphic resonance means when you lock into elevated timeline, you make that timeline more accessible to every consciousness entangled with your field. Your successful navigation doesn't just benefit you, it creates template in collective field that others can access when they approach their own timeline shifts. First wave navigators do hardest work because they're establishing patterns in morphic field where no patterns existed before. Each person after that finds the shift incrementally easier because field contains successful examples. You're reading this in January because your consciousness is part of first wave making timeline shifts during this annual initialization window. Not everyone shifts timelines simultaneously. Some shift this January. Others shift during different threshold moments throughout year. But those who shift in January, during maximum collective coherence, serve as anchors for shifts that occur later. Your timeline stabilization now creates stability in collective field that supports others' shifts during their threshold moments. The children incarnating over next several years need adults established in elevated timelines to teach them quantum consciousness operations. If insufficient numbers shift timelines consciously, these children incarnate into a world where old paradigm still dominates collective field. Your shift now, during this January, directly affects what reality these incoming souls experience. You're not just changing your life, you're literally helping create world they'll grow up in. But there's also immediate collective impact. Every person you interact with throughout 2026 will be affected by whichever timeline you locked into during January. If you locked into old timeline repetition, your presence maintains separation consciousness in collective field. If you locked into elevated timeline, your presence generates unity awareness that affects everyone around you, whether they consciously recognize it or not. Your timeline choice isn't private. It ripples through collective field, touching everyone your consciousness connects with. Collective consciousness is approaching critical threshold where enough individuals operating from elevated timelines tips entire species field into new paradigm. Ancient prophecies, indigenous teachings, quantum consciousness researchers all point to this generation as the one where collective shift becomes possible. But possibility doesn't guarantee actualization. The shift only occurs if enough individuals make personal timeline shifts that cumulatively reorganize collective field. Your January timeline choice is vote in cosmic election, determining whether humanity crosses threshold or remains in old paradigm for another cycle. Write in comments right now. My timeline serves the collective. This isn't noble sentiment. It's quantum recognition that individual timelines exist within collective timeline field. When you consciously align with elevated personal timeline, you contribute to collective timeline elevation. And when enough individuals make similar alignment, collective field tips into new configuration that makes elevated consciousness accessible to everyone, not just first-wave navigators. Share this transmission with anyone you sense might be navigating timeline shift during this January. Not to convince them of anything, but to provide frequency support that helps them recognize and stabilize in timeline they're already shifting into. Every person whose timeline locks consciously during January initialization strengthens morphic field for everyone. We're not isolated consciousness evolving separately. We're unified field learning to operate quantum mechanically. And timeline shifts are how that learning manifests at individual and collective levels simultaneously. Everything I've shared, the